Greetings. On a cold and wintry evening, thank you all for coming out. Personally, I am very thankful for the weather gods that either split this front and had one go up the East Coast and then one hit Nashville and Memphis. So we have had enough snow this year, and I am glad that we didn't get any more, particularly to interfere with Dr. Larry Wilson's lecture here tonight. For those of you who don't know Larry, he is a founding member of the World Affairs Council here in Western North Carolina. He was past president and has served as president of Marietta College in Ohio. He did yeoman and dutiful work here as an interim chair, as an interim president of UNCA. Anybody that takes that kind of role on needs to have Purple Hearts decorating his lapel. Anyway, he was a founder and provost of Zayed University in UAE. I'm sure he will say something about that later tonight, which he continues to advise and visit every year. He goes over there 2 or 3 times every year, and we welcome him tonight to talk about the Persian Gulf. I would like to remind you to turn off buzzers, cell phones, other throbbing and ringing devices so that the rest of us aren't bothered by your phone calls. Let's welcome Dr. Larry Wilson.
Thank you, George. Can you hear okay back there? I can hear myself echoing. I appreciate that most generous introduction, George, but he did forget one very important point about which I'm quite proud. I was president of my 6th grade class twice. I will say a little bit about the United Arab Emirates, and of course, George's mentioning about turning off cell phone reminds me of an occasion that happened in a crowd of 1,000 people, I guess, when His Excellency Sheikh Nahyan bin Mubarak Al Nahyan was speaking, and somebody's cell phone went off. And he hates that. And he froze. And he said, "Who was it?" And everybody's going. Finally, this lady put her hand up and he said, "Out. Come to the front and walk out." Well, needless to say, a whole lot of phones went off after that. I mean, on the switch, not by ringing. That was a little bit harsh. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be here tonight to say a little bit about what little I know concerning what is often called the Persian Gulf, but having spent my time in the Arabic part, I refer to it as the Arabic Gulf, Arabian Gulf, as you can see up there. And I put up on this first slide, and these are reproduced in the handouts, and I'm not sure whether we had enough or not, so if some of you can share and pass another one to the back, there's some in the back that didn't get this. These are priceless, but they're also valueless. Actually, George is the best weather person I've yet to know, because last night when we talked, we thought, well, this isn't going to happen. And then today, the sun comes out. So either he controls the weather or he knows nothing about it. I'm not sure which. Since we're going to talk about the Arabian Gulf and associated countries, I want to welcome you as Arabs would traditionally welcome people by saying Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. And of course you would answer back, alaikum assalam, and upon you. So now we're all in good shape. I want to expand just a little bit. Oh, Janie brought my power cord in case this battery runs down on the computer. I forgot it. I want to expand a little bit upon the designated title, which is in the Great Decisions book, which I suspect most of you have not seen, but it's a book that is available, not free. But its title there is The United States and the Persian Gulf. But I want to expand that a bit, as you see on this. Let's see, I think if I work this, they can see it better. the Arabian Gulf and associated countries, because this, as many, perhaps most of you know, is a very complicated, often interwoven region of the world, with a number of countries which have a piece from time to time of what someone else's business might be. So I want to say a little bit about that. Try to get this microphone so it's about right. Let me begin by saying right up front that I'm not an expert in all the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf countries. I spent 6 years, as George indicated, living and working in the United Arab Emirates, and we'll see on the map in a moment, that's down toward the bottom of the Arabian Gulf. And I've done some work in Qatar, or Qatar, as many people would say. I've not lived or worked in Iraq or Iran, although I tried to go to Iran once, Jenny and I did, but at that point, American citizens couldn't get visas. Now they might not want them, I don't know. But we bought a lot of Persian rugs, so we got that part covered. I'm going to put on my glasses here. I'm in the intermediate phase of distance. The issues that go on involving the United States and the Arabian Gulf are sort of outlined up here, but of course I won't really follow that outline, but you'll think I'm organized by my putting it up there, so I wanted to be sure to have a chance to see that. These countries have a mixed history, and we'll take a quick look at, I have a number of PowerPoint slides which are on the handouts. We're going to go through some of those pretty fast because I want to look for trends, not for individual details, and then if you want to look at the details, you can look at the slides later on. Because I want to do a little bit of historical background leading up to current situation in the Arabian Gulf, and that involves, of course, two very simple things: oil and oil. But then we might throw in a little bit of terrorism and military adventures as well. But it really begins for the United States with oil, as we'll see in a few moments. What we do know is that some parts of the... Come on here. Oh, wrong one. There we go. In order to get us all located, some parts of the world map are shown here. You can see, of course, what's going on? Africa, Europe, Asia would be up there. The part we're going to look at is not any of these big bodies of water, but around this little bitty body right there. And I'll look at it in more detail in a moment. We're going to look first at the countries which are tangent to the Arabian Gulf. And then the next ring, what I will call the ring countries, those that are one more layer out, because they are involved in a lot of ways with what goes on in the Arabian Gulf. And then there's some others that are kind of juxtaposed out into space, like China and Russia, which have a lot of influence and have had for some time in the affairs of the Arabian Gulf. And of course, if you heard the comments today or the quotes of our Secretary of State, China has a new assignment, we hope, and we'll see how that comes out as well. So let's look then at a little closer. Here you can see, let's see if I use this pointer, they can, where is it? We're going to look at, this is going to be tricky. They can't pick up the laser pointer apparently on the camera, so I'll try to do it in my left hand here. We're going to look down here. Here's Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, come down to Saudi Arabia, an island, Bahrain, another peninsula, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, where we lived, and Oman, which may look like it's not actually on the Arabian Gulf, but it is, because it has a little bitty point up here called a external or, what's the word I want? Anyway, it's a small point called the Musandam Peninsula. That actually is a beautiful area. You can go up there and play with the dolphins. It's called the Scandinavian fords of the Middle East because it has very high bluffs and cliffs that sit right on the ocean. It's actually a beautiful place. But it's separated from the rest of Oman by the United Arab Emirates. So we're going to look at this group of countries here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of those out around, such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, not so much about Turkey or Syria, Israel and Palestine, of course, maybe a little bit about Egypt. Now, you probably are aware that so often we talk in this group of countries as what's called the MENA, Middle East, North Africa, MENA. That, of course, runs all across North Africa here. These are all Arabic-speaking countries. Sometimes Pakistan is folded in, sometimes not. Sometimes Sudan and Somalia are folded in, sometimes not. So it's not a well-defined group. The basic core of the MENA countries are about 20. But then there are those others that are sometimes included, such as Pakistan and Somalia and Sudan. Let me back up just a moment because I wanted to point out, look at the relative sizes, the mass of these countries. Here's Iran, huge. Here's Saudi Arabia, even bigger. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, the land mass, the area of Saudi Arabia is about as big as all the rest of the countries that touch the Arabian Gulf. And we'll see that Iran has a population bigger than all the rest of those countries. So we have some very interesting dynamics. Down here on the bottom, Oman, that little tip, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, these are all desert countries. Bedouins for centuries, millennia, now have, with the discovery of oil, of course, become very, very wealthy. The size of the Arabian Gulf is about half that of the Red Sea and about twice that of all the Great Lakes together. So it's not a real big body of water. Its average depth is only about 50 meters. So it's very shallow, not very big. It is connected, of course, to the ocean out here through the Straits of Hormuz, about which you've, I'm sure, heard a few things. Janie and I happened to be staying in a hotel right over here in the city of Fujairah just before the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. And it was a stormy night, and we looked out and counted, how many ships were there, Janie? How many? 63 American warships anchored out in this harbor. It looked like a gigantic city of ships not wanting to go through the Straits of Hormuz in this storm because it's fairly narrow and fairly shallow. So it's a very interesting place. I also want to say a little bit more about how these countries, and down here, it works a little different than it does up here, and we'll see that in a moment. But let me tell you a little bit about how the Arabs that we knew make decisions. When I first started going to the United Arab Emirates in 1998 as a consultant, helping to found this University for Emirati Women, I was meeting with the Minister of Higher Education, His Excellency Sheikh Nahyan Mubarak Al Nahyan, and in our conversation, I was asking him about timetables. He said, "Larry, I want action, not a debating society like you have in the United States." I thought, I wonder what that means. But then we found out, because he announced in February of 1998 that they had found a new university for Emirati women. February. And said that kind of nonchalantly. And we would open it in 6 months, in August, which we did. Now, when the university was announced, there were no students, no buildings, no faculty, no administration, no curriculum, nothing but a vision. Well, in the United States, we'd say that couldn't happen because we could easily debate that for 10 years and maybe never have it. Another item, some of you have heard this story, as Janie and I were getting ready to leave to come back to the U.S., the Minister of Education, there are two education ministries, higher education and education. The Minister of Education asked if I would meet with him, and I said, sure. It was the day before we were leaving, and he said he wanted to know if I'd stay and help him design a program to reform all the public schools in the country. And I said, well, we're getting ready to leave. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, can you be flexible? And I said, well, what are you thinking about? And he said, oh, how about a week? And I said, a week to design a plan to reform all the public schools? He said, yes. And I said, I knew him well and I teased him a lot. And I said, well, Hanif, I suppose if you wanted it tomorrow, you would ask tomorrow, wouldn't you? He said, no, the next day. That's the way decision-making works. They work pretty much on what I call the 40% principle. If you've got it 40% together, you launch it, and then you fix it on the way. Now, they have the resources to do that, but they have, in my experience, an unparalleled capability for risk. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. They know some won't. They simply try to get it done. So let's see what population, to put it in numbers. Here you see Iran, clearly the largest, and approximately the size of all the rest of the 8 countries that touch the Arabian Gulf in terms of population, 7.2 million. Then we have the surface area. Here's Saudi Arabia, 1.1 million. These are in thousands, so this would be 1.1 million square miles. Approximately, well, quite a bit bigger than all the other 7 countries together. So we have one gigantic country compared to the others, and one with big population compared to the others. The country we were in, of course, UAE, is, well, this says 6.8. I think that's probably high, but that's the data from the IMF, I guess. But very small, about the size of Maine. So that little blip down at the bottom. Whoops, I went 2. I want to stress for just a moment that the governments in these countries, while they are often thought by Westerners to be all the same, they're really quite a bit different. But they have a lot in common too. We have up here the Islamic Republic. Actually, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran, founded with the revolution in 1979. But Iran, of course, is an ancient country, thought to begin about 550 BC. But this is the most recent. Iraq has, well, I put a question mark there because we think they're going to have a parliamentary republic, but of course, time will tell, won't it? We'll hope. Saudi Arabia has what's called an Islamic absolute monarchy. You have to be in the family, and you succeed by whatever mechanism, usually the oldest son. You go on down here, the UAE is a little different. It has a federal constitutional monarchy. There's actually an election of the president of the country by the rulers of the 7 states, the 7 emirates in the United Arab Emirates. And this is a kind of loose federation because these 7, as we would think of states, 7 countries, 40 years ago were basically Bedouin tribes, often at war with each other. So they've been brought together in a very loose federation. And you can go on down through here and see various kinds. Each has, except for the Islamic Republic, which, of course, Iran, you know, has a long history of electing government officials, clear back into the 1940s and 50s. And they just had a nice election this last summer. And, gee, don't we wish our president could get 70% of the vote? Amazing outcome. I want to say just a little bit about the religions. And actually, that may be out of place. Yeah, I want this one first. All of these countries that are touching the Persian Gulf, and essentially all the MENA countries, the Middle East, North Africa, are Islamic countries. Some of them have strict Islamic rule, some of them don't. But they all have Islam as the official language, official religion, and most of them have either a predominance of one of the 2 sects of Islam. Islam was founded in 1632, as you probably know, Prophet Muhammad, and his name always appears with these 4 letters after it, which means peace be upon him. The Shias, one of the two major sects of Islam, claim at least to be descendants from the Prophet. The Sunnis are not direct descendants, and so there's a branch there. But initially it dealt with succession of leadership of Islam, but now it's a lot more widely separated, more into religious philosophy, more into the way the religion interacts with the government. So these are two substantially different sects of Islam. Persians, as you probably know, are not Arabs. Persians are descendants of Indo-Europeans. And basically, the way they define a citizen of Persia, of Iran, those two are used synonymously, is whether their mother tongue is Persian or Farsi. So the population of Persia is far more mixed in terms of heritage than any of the other Gulf countries. The Arabs all come from the Semitic Arabic. Most of them are Sunnis, whereas most of the Persians are Shias. And that makes a big difference in the kind of government that they have. Let's go back one here. As you can see in Iran, almost all of the citizens are Shias. The only Sunnis in Iran are on the eastern side, on the side toward India. The rest of the country is heavily dominated by the Shia sect of Islam. Bahrain, which is not too far, just across the corner of the Gulf from Iran, has a high percentage of Shias, but the rest of the countries have pretty small amounts, down to Qatar and the UAE, which have less than 1% Shias, almost entirely Sunnis. Now, I couldn't find complete data in the next column, but it's very important. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, or in Qatar, the percentage of actual nationals in those countries is roughly 1 in 5 or less. In other words, at least 4/5, in the UAE, 90% of the people who live there and reside there are foreigners who come there to work. You can't become a citizen of the UAE unless you're an Emirati, or if you're a male and you marry a non-Emirati female, she can become a citizen. There are a few exceptions to that. A few Iranians have been grandfathered because their families have been in the UAE for dozens, if not 100 years. So Iran, almost all their citizens are nationals, citizens. Almost all their residents are citizens. In Qatar and the UAE, the other extreme, very few. Now imagine trying to govern a country where you and your citizens only make up maybe 15%. We have enough trouble getting people to agree when we're almost all citizens. And we worry about a few people who may come in that are undocumented. Well, you can have a whole lot of undocumented in that law, although their strict visa requirements are far more severe than ours. Okay, let's look at some of the primary issues. What's going on? Here we go. What are the major issues in the Arabian Gulf today that confront the U.S. and really the whole world? They're a pretty simple list. Big surprise, oil's on the top. Palestine, Israel, which is a major issue, not just with the Palestinians and the Israelis, but with the entire Arab world. And until that's solved, I think there'll never be peace and there'll never be acceptability of Westerners at the level we would like to have. Then there are the issues of Iraq and Iran. Some religious issues where Shias and Sunnis, like in Iraq, are often not getting along. But you don't just have to be sects of Muslim or of Islam not to get along, because there are plenty of cases like the Balkans where people didn't get along all that well either. Afghanistan, Pakistan remain major issues, not only for the United States, but for the whole Gulf region. China and Russia. Russia is a fairly long-term player in the Middle East. China, less so. But let me tell you, China is becoming much more of a player. When we first went to the UAE, there were maybe 10,000 Chinese working there. When we left, there were about 300,000. So part of that 90% of foreigners in the UAE or in Qatar, are from China. Mostly laborers, but a lot of shopkeepers and things like that. In fact, if you like shopping, in Dubai there's something called the Dragon Mart. Now, the Dragon Mart is a building shaped like a dragon. Where else but the UAE, right? It's said to be the largest Chinese shopping mart outside of Beijing. 4,000 shops. You can pick up a lot of trinkets. Terrorism, of course, pervades this area, and global climate change, and I put that at the bottom, and I don't want to come back to it, but let me just say something now. The reason global climate change is so important in the Gulf area, they're concerned about continuing to sell oil, because most of these countries are oil rich, some of them want more than others, and we'll see then. B, they're worried, and this is one of the issues now with Saudi Arabia and the United States. They're real nervous about our pushing for energy independence and alternative forms of energy, because the Saudis have just spent billions of dollars upgrading their facilities to produce more oil. And now our administration is talking about trying to use less. They're not real happy about that. And then, of course, there's the whole matter of air pollution, which is fairly bad in some of the cities. And if climate does change, who knows what those desert countries are going to look like. It could be more desert. It'd be hard to be more than that. The annual rainfall in Dubai is 1/2 inch, so it'd be hard to be much less. What's going on here? There we go. Okay, what are some questions that we need to think about? Some of these I'll try to answer in our talk tonight. Others I hope you'll think about, maybe you argue with your neighbors about, convince them of one way or the other. Let's just quickly look at a few, and you'll have many others, I know. What are the events in the Arabian Gulf region over which the United States has no control? What might they be? What tools do we have, we being the United States, for dealing with Iran? Not as many as we'd like, probably, but maybe more than some would think. This is a real tough one. How to improve the image of the United States in the Muslim world? Because until that rapport is improved, and it's gotten very bad over the last decade or more, until that's improved, we're not going to be able to get the kind of support that we need to damp down on terrorism and things of that nature. This is a real interesting one. The military deals. The UAE and Qatar probably have the greatest military forces on this planet, and maybe in the universe. The UAE has fighter jets from the United States that are more advanced than the ones our Air Force has. How does that happen? It's called oil money coming back to the U.S., right? Let me tell you a story about that. This will give you real confidence, too. The U.S. has a big air base out in the desert in the UAE. And they have a number of people hired, both from the U.S. and from England, the UK, to teach the Emiratis how to fly fighter jets. So we were talking to this guy who came from the UK, from England, who was a teacher. And I said, Mark, tell me about your class when you're teaching these Emiratis how to fly these high-powered jets. And he started laughing. I said, well, what's so funny? He said, well, I'll typically have a class of 20. And on any given day, there might be 15 there, maybe 18 or maybe 12. And so when the next day, but there'll be somebody in the seat. And the next day when Muhammad comes back, he said, I would say to him, Muhammad, you missed yesterday, and maybe the day before. How are you going to learn to fly these jets when you're not in class? He said, oh, sir, do not worry. My driver was here, and he told me everything you said. Now, I don't know if you want your F-16s being flown by a guy who's taught by his driver, but I don't think I do. A big question, of course, is, will the diplomatic relations with Iran be a success? Because if they're not, we and much of the world has a real problem, as we'll see in a few moments. What about the royal monarchy system? What do you think about that? That kind of leadership, that kind of governance. Let me tell you a little quick story. In a country in this region, especially in the Arab South, the access to the leaders is unbelievable. For example, my boss, Sheikh Nahyan, who is the Minister of Higher Education, every night but Friday, which is Holy Night, Holy Day night, every night but Friday, he holds what's called a majlis, which would be a large room, open room, where anybody can come and have an audience with him. You don't need an appointment. You might get, 30 seconds. You might get, as I once did, an hour and a half. But everyone who shows up can see the Minister of Higher Education. Or you could go to a different majlis and see the Foreign Affairs Minister, Sheikh Abdullah. Or you could go see the Minister of Economy, Sheikh Ubna. That's a kind of access that I don't think we have. At least I haven't been able to see the Secretary of Education yet on TV sometimes. So even though these are not democracies as we know them, now this is a small country, UAE. So it's not like trying to go to Washington. But the fact is that these ministers all hold these open sessions, allows the citizens or visitors to the country to have access to raise a grievance, to ask for something, to explain something, whatever it might be. So that's part of the royal monarchy system. It's part of the history of the Bedouins, who are extremely gracious in entertaining guests. What are the outcomes of the elections in Iran and Iraq? Well, we think we know about Iran, at least for now. Iraq, I guess we'll find out in a couple or 3 weeks, won't we, when they have the next election there. Here's the big one. Can Israel and Palestine find a way to live in peace? That's been going on for 60 years, and we'll see, hopefully somehow something will happen to encourage that. And finally, nuclear weapons. And a question I want to raise to you is, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, in a few minutes, but the question I want to raise is, does it really make any difference whether Iran has a nuclear bomb or not? 9 countries have them already. So what if Iran gets one? Well, the whole world is, at least a lot of the world, the Western world's on edge about that. My question to you is, would it really make any difference? When Obama came to office, these were some of his priorities. Withdrawal from Iraq, leaving it stable. Stabilization of Afghanistan and getting out of there as quickly as possible. Diplomacy with Iran. Diminishing threat of terrorism. And there's some others, but these are major ones. And the question is, what progress are we making? And where are the obstacles? Domestically, well, we know how these are going. When Obama was elected, there was dancing in the streets and cheering in the Arab world as well as in most of the world. There was great enthusiasm and optimism about what he could do, what he represented, a change of government in the U.S. this time, not in a Gulf country. And the speech that President Obama gave in Cairo, from which I've produced just one paragraph here, brought great optimism to the Arab world. Finally, they thought, the United States has a president who will rely more on diplomacy than strength, who will understand and respect Islam. Maybe they were confused by his middle name, I don't know. But at any rate, very positive response. Very high expectations, probably higher than in the United States, if you look at a whole country. And part of what we want to look at tonight is, what's the reading now? I don't know if any of you read Al Jazeera. You can get it on the internet, or some of you may have satellite and you can get it on satellite, the English version. But they've had a number of interesting programs or articles about Obama now a year later and have the promises been fulfilled and so on. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And that, by the way, that paragraph's reproduced in your handout, so I don't want to read it at this point. I want to quickly run through and look for trends in 3 or 4 tables, which are results of Gallup World Poll or the University of Maryland Global Public Attitudes Poll. And just quickly look at the trends. Here the question was asked, this was last fall, Muslim Western interactions, are they better now than they were a year and a half or 2 years ago? And you can see Bahrain far better, most of the Gulf countries somewhat better. More saying they're worse. Some the same. Two notable ones I put down here, which aren't actually Arab Gulf countries, Palestine and Israel, because they both rate them very low. This was last September. They're worse than they were a year before, they would say. And again, these data are in your sheet if you want to look at the numbers. We're looking for trends. Can violence, I should say violence, not violent, conflict, violent conflict, yeah, can that be avoided? Same group of countries. Everybody says yes. Some very strongly yes. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, interestingly, Iran. That was taken just after their election last summer, in the early fall, before the demonstrations had occurred, but not just last week. Okay, so what we can see then is, and this would be across the MENA area, that basically every country says, yes, violence can be avoided by diplomacy and better relationships with each other. The question here was, will greater Muslim-Western interactions improve the conditions? Is that interaction a threat? Bahrain says 20% say it is a threat. 65% say greater interactions would be a benefit. And you can see the trend again. Basically pretty small till you get down to Israel, where they're about balanced, and somewhat higher in Palestine, where saying the threat is larger than the rest of the Gulf countries. Well, this is beginning to tell us something about how we're perceived. No, this is the last one of these. Quality of Muslim-West interactions. Is it important or is it not important? And the question mark over here means either they didn't respond or they chose not to, didn't have an opinion, whatever. Here again you can see that quality Muslim-West interactions, everyone thinks that would improve peace and stability in the Middle East. Well, big surprise. We'd hope it would, wouldn't we? Let's quickly skim through the historical development of oil. And I'm not going to go through every one of these in detail because they're on your slides. But basically, oil was discovered in the Middle East, in Iran, about 1900, so roughly 110 years ago, by the British. And as most oil companies operate, they were able to work out an arrangement where they exported essentially all the oil to Britain, almost none remaining in Iran. And this, if you just quickly skim down here, you can see in the early 20s, Bahrain, oil was discovered. Finally, the United States got into Arab oil. And by the way, our entry as a country into the Gulf region really was through oil. And that was about 30 years before there was much government involvement. Chevron now, it used to be Standard Oil of California, Mobil, Texaco, Exxon were heavy players in Gulf oil drilling, exploration, drilling, and production. And you can see here a quick skim of that. World War II pretty much stopped that. But World War II did something else. It showed to the world, really, the value of oil. During the war, of course, it was what? Flying airplanes, running tanks, whatever it might be. Up till that time, the value of oil was not treated so highly. And in fact, the production was exceeding demand until about 1960. Down here, production or supply exceeded demand. By 1970, there was a balance between supply and demand, pretty much. And that was a turning point in the price of oil and in the way oil was developed and produced. Because up till that time, when supply was exceeding demand, the Gulf countries pretty much left it to the Western oil companies to do the drilling, to do the producing, and to collect most of the money. But when all of a sudden supply was not up to demand, the Arab countries, well, and Iran too, the Gulf countries, discovered that, aha, there's serious money to be made here. And they began to nationalize the oil companies. And that's true in all the Gulf countries now. In many cases, we hold partnerships but they're basically nationalized, with the government now determining where will the fields be explored for, in what areas, what will the production rate be, and eventually through OPEC setting the prices. This gives you a quick idea. This is, 8 years old, and I apologize for that, but I couldn't find newer data in a nice table. What it shows is that the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf has about 66% of the world's proven oil reserves. 2/3 in this little region of the world. This is a real key issue here, especially in light of the announcement today from Secretary of State Clinton. Excess oil production. Most of that is in Saudi Arabia, by the way, which of course has enormous oil reserves. And the reason this is important is in Secretary Clinton's announcement, what was she trying to do, or is she trying to do? She's trying to get Saudi Arabia to agree to provide the oil to China that they've been getting from Iran. Because in trying to develop sanctions for Iran, China is an obstacle. Because about almost 30%, 25% of Chinese oil comes from Iran. They don't want the Iranians mad at them. But if, in this manipulation, Saudi Arabia will agree to provide the oil to China, then maybe China will support the sanctions that the U.S. government wants. So this excess capacity is a very important item. And Saudi Arabia has just spent billions of US dollars expanding its capacity, thinking it was going to sell it to the United States, and it will, but also perhaps now to China. Natural gas reserves, a lot of this is in both Iran and Qatar. They hold about a third, between them they hold about half of the world's gas reserves. Oil production capacity, as you can see, it's about 30% of the world's total. And here oil production is about 26% of the world's total. What are some of the early relationships between Western countries and Iran? World War II, Iran was a major player in an interesting way. It served as the only secure supply route for Western materials to get to the Soviet Union. Coming around the Horn of Africa, through the Arabian Gulf to Iran, then by train to Russia. So that was an early involvement of the United States with Iran in a rather interesting way. It wasn't oil-based. Well, it might have been partly, but primarily it wasn't. Okay, after World War II, the United States began to focus on two countries primarily in the Gulf, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, why do you suppose that was the case? One's Arabic, one's Persian, one's Sunni, one's Shia. Why do you suppose? Well, they both had oil, right? Saudi Arabia, largest supply. Iran, second largest supply. It wasn't by accident. But they also, remember, the biggest land mass and the greatest populations. So that was the basis of what turned out to be the twin pillars approach to the Middle East. And I'll come back to that in a moment. 1953, a very important event happened, which probably made a lot of sense at the time, but it's been a catastrophe since then. And many of you already remember that at this point, 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh had been elected, I underscore elected, as the Prime Minister of Iran. And at this point, and he was very strongly opposed to foreign intervention in Iran, anti-imperialist. He nationalized the oil company, which ticked off the British because all of a sudden they weren't controlling the Iranian oil reserves like they had been up to that point, even though they were a partner in this new arrangement, but still they weren't making the final decisions. So the CIA, coupling with M16 in England, organized this coup, overthrew Mossadegh, and replaced him with the Shah. That has infuriated the Iranians to this day. They'll not let us forget it. We may never be able to repair it. And of course, we have the other side of that, which occurred with the taking of the American hostages in 1979, right? We're mad at the Iranians because they took our hostages. They're mad at us because we overthrew their democratically elected leader and imposed a Shah who they didn't like to start with, and who was very pro-American. And he was viewed virtually as a stool pigeon for America. Whatever we wanted, the Shah would try to deliver. So you can see all of a sudden, 60 years ago, the tension became very severe between our two countries. In the 1960s, the British, who had been the protectorate for all of the Gulf countries except for Iran and Saudi Arabia, a little bit of Saudi Arabia, but mostly the others, the British decided they were leaving for a lot of reasons. That meant these countries were all of a sudden sort of cut loose on their own. And by the 70s, they became independent. In the United Arab Emirates, for example, 1971 became their day of independence when their new country was formed, this federation. And it was pretty much that way in the Gulf. Now, all of a sudden, the United States, which had been depending on England for stability and security in the Gulf, didn't have the British anymore. So what are we going to do? Because we've got major oil coming from the Gulf, and we want to keep that supply flowing. Well, then, of course, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah, created the Islamic Republic of Iran, took the hostages, and from there on, we've had a different relationship with Iran, because now we're, what, the great Satan to Iran. But that's okay, we call them the axis of evil. We're about ready to talk about what's called the Twin Pillars policy, and let me just say a little bit more about that while we're trying to get a visual back. This is the policy that was created by President Nixon after the British announced that they were leaving the Gulf. No longer would be the protectorates and providing the stability and the military support. It's called the Twin Pillars because Iran and Saudi Arabia were encouraged to become kind of the watch people for the region. And even better, we were able to convince them to spend billions of US oil dollars to buy US military equipment. So we had a flow of petrodollars in kind of a cycle coming back to the US. That worked pretty well for a while until 1979 and the Islamic Revolution, and all of a sudden one of the two pillars was gone, Iran. That left Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have never been real pro-American. They're not too bad, but not real pro, not like the Shah of Iran was. So consequently, we're now faced with who's going to watch over the Gulf and this enormous oil reserve that's in these Gulf countries when the twin pillars collapsed. Now, this policy was started by Nixon, continued by Carter, continued and strengthened by Reagan. Well, let's go ahead without the overheads, and you can sort of track through on your handouts. So as the twin pillars collapsed, about the time that President Clinton came into office, he developed what he called the principle of containment, which was basically one of stability. U.S. military bases in almost every country except Iran and Iraq. Some of them very heavily equipped, like initially Saudi Arabia, then less Saudi Arabia, but Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, all have substantial U.S. military bases to try to provide stability, status quo, no big changes, in order to contain and assure stability of the countries in the Gulf and the flow and access of oil. Again, oil is an underlying principle all the way through. But now, actually beginning with the first Gulf War, actually beginning in 1988, a Saudi, Osama bin Laden, created Al-Qaeda. And if you haven't seen it, there's a book in our library called the Al-Qaeda Reader, which is a very interesting little book. Except I have it checked out right now, but it'll be on reserve for my class. But in this book, it's a translation of the papers of bin Laden and Zawahiri and other major leaders of Al-Qaeda. But the point I want to make is that all of a sudden, after 1988, there was a new element introduced into the Gulf. and that is this first rather fringe, small, somewhat radical terrorist organization. As you know, I'm sure, that after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States decided to help the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Why? Because we were concerned that the Russians, by moving into Afghanistan, were then going to come across into the Gulf and eventually get to these Gulf oil supplies. Now, the Russians, of course, contended their action was primarily defensive because the communist government in Afghanistan was faltering, and they simply were there to help out. As our first speaker said, well, how'd that go? The British are good about saying goodbye, about leaving without saying goodbye, and the Russians say goodbye but never leave. Well, oh, great. Okay, the Twin Pillars were pretty well finished there, I think. Except what I wanted to point out is that we had an ally in Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan while the Soviets were there. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, wanted to continue the close relationship with the United States and be part of ousting the heathen Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. We refused that help. That is often thought to be the reason that Osama bin Laden immediately turned against the United States. Now, I know it's more complicated than that, but that's a major factor. And what was an ally in Afghanistan all of a sudden was not an ally in the Gulf. The second component, of course, which angered bin Laden at the United States and at his home country of Saudi Arabia, is that after they had ousted the Soviets, the infidels from the Muslim country of Afghanistan, here was his home country, Saudi Arabia, inviting the Americans to come in and have a military base. He didn't like that either. He had a consistency, in spite of the fact that we might not like his consistency. Okay, so in 1996, bin Laden declared a jihad against the United States. And of course, you know, it wasn't long after that, there were bombings in the embassy in Kenya, in the embassy in Tanzania, and of course then in 2001, the Twin Towers in New York City. This is the Clinton policy of dual containment. With the Twin Towers gone, how are we going to contain the enemies in the Gulf? And that was really Clinton's idea, his concern. So we beefed up our military presence. The aim was to pretty much keep political stability, secure oil supplies, avoid regional dominance. And by this time, the regional dominance that we were worried about was what? Iran in particular. And of course, Saddam Hussein was still there. But frankly, all the time that we were in the UAE, I could say I never heard anybody, any Arab, who felt a fear of Saddam Hussein. They thought he was a despicable human being, cruel and brutal, and his sons were worse. And we heard some pretty bad stories, Jenny and I did, from Iraqis who lived in the UAE. But they didn't really have a fear of him. And there was a good thing. He kept Iran in balance, even though he fought them for 8 years and all that kind of stuff. But he was part of the balance, which made it easier for Clinton to have a policy of containment if Iran was being sort of balanced off by Iraq. Very complicated geopolitics by two neighboring countries. Also kept the oil price down. When Jenny and I were in Jordan, we found out that you could buy gasoline in Jordan for, what was it, 7 cents a gallon, I think. This was about 2004 or something like that. Because Saddam Hussein was supplying Iraqi petroleum to Jordan because Jordan was taking a lot of refugees from Palestine and other places. Well, following the 2001 catastrophe in New York, President Bush developed a different policy toward the Middle East, what you might call one of political change, democratization. And of course, the first target was going to be what? Iraq. And by establishing a democracy in Iraq, then there would be a domino effect because it would be so successful there that the other Arab countries would want one too. That's worked out real well. So we invaded with the idea of a regime change. And that was different than any policy we'd had in the Gulf before. None of the presidents, going back to the 1930s, had tried to bring about regime changes. They tried to stabilize. They tried to form various kinds of cooperative consortia, but not to change the government, except where? Iran, where we mastered a coup to overthrow the prime minister who was elected and replace him with a military or a coup appointment from our country. Okay, what does the future look like? Well, who knows? But we know there's several issues. In Iraq, of course, there's the huge issue that may get some clarity in the election next month about the president. But we don't know for sure. Will al-Maliki win? If he does, what's his attitude toward the U.S. going to be? Can he provide what he claims he can, and that is security and safety and infrastructure to the country? I think that's unknown. And can he provide it in the absence of the Americans? Will he change his mind and want us to stay longer? Will our presidents want to stay longer if invited? Do the Iraqi people want us to stay? Very, very fundamental questions about the future in Iraq. In Iran, there's considerable questions about what's going to happen in this country. Of course, the election last summer, we have read a lot about, and the protests that followed, and the fact that last week, the 31st anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, the government clamped down so hard on protesters that the only ones present, not the only ones, most of the ones present were government supporters. Big surprise. I read or heard that the government required every government worker to show up at work at a certain time so they could get on a bus to go to demonstrate. Now there's an interesting poll that I just read, and I can't remember if this is on Al Jazeera. Given the unrest in Iran about the government, and a lot of people saying about 40% of the Iranians support the government, about 40% don't, and 20% don't commit. But there was a poll taken just last week that showed that about 65% of the Iranian public believe that the election was legitimate. Now, the question is, how did that happen? It's not what we hear. It's probably not what most of us want to think. But I don't know exactly the conditions. This wasn't carried out by Ahmadinejad, I don't think, but it might have been by the Basik. Anyway, if these numbers are right, then there's more support for the government than we've been led to believe. If they're wrong, then, and we don't know. I don't know how it was sampled. I don't know whether the Revolutionary Guard said, would you please fill this out? I want to look at it when you're finished, which might lead to one result, or whether it was the kind of poll that we would think would be acceptable. But at any rate, a very interesting statistic, and of course one that Ahmadinejad is finding great happiness about. I've got a couple other notes about Iran that I wanted to talk about. We already talked about the Clinton policy announced today to try to get China, in order to get sanctions in Iran, against Iran. And what's the purpose of those sanctions? It revolves around nuclear energy, right? And I hope I have time to do a little physics about atomic bombs or nuclear bombs at the end. We'll see if we do or not. But it involves the question of sanctions. Now, the question I would pose to you, do sanctions work? Who gets hurt the worst by sanctions? Is it the government? Is it the military? Is it the citizen on the street? And I think in many cases, it's the citizen on the street that's most disadvantaged by sanctions. Now, President Obama wants to target these toward the Revolutionary Guard. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but maybe it can be done. I don't know. But one thing we don't want to happen, it seems to me, is to isolate Iran even more, because it seems that the protesters are crying for less isolation, more information. And if we clamp down on sanctions that are too heavy, Maybe the internet will disappear, or maybe Twitter will disappear, or maybe the mobile or cell phones will disappear. In which case there'll be less information going to the people that we probably want to most have the information. You know, they say one of the reasons that the demonstrations were so small last week at the 31st anniversary, well, first, because there was heavy government guarding, and those Basik characters, who must be really nasty, were out in force. But also because the protesters, the opponents, couldn't get information about what to do. And you heard stories about people being out on the streets and sort of milling around because they weren't sure where the gathering points were and so on, because the government had jammed the telecommunication system. Well, that's a problem. And so we need to find ways to open the telecommunication system, it seems to me, rather than closing them. And then, of course, there's the question about what's Saudi Arabia going to do in the Gulf? Big question, because there's a lot of anti-American sentiment in Saudi Arabia. They have, remember, they had a very high percentage, almost entirely Sunnis, but they host a very unusual subsect of the Sunnis called the Wahhabi, which are very conservative, tend to be more radical than the other Sunnis. And of course, that's where bin Laden came from. So King Abdullah has to be very careful in Saudi Arabia not to infuriate his people by being too close to the West. Real major problem for him. Okay, some of you may have seen this. I saw it by accident and then tracked it down. This is a picture of the Islamic flag of Iran. It was adopted in 1979, a new flag, because the previous one had the coat of arms for the Shah. That didn't seem to be the right thing. So they replaced that by this one. Then last week, I just happened to see a photo of President Ahmadinejad standing in front of this flag. Now there's one very important point here. The bottom color is red, the middle color is white, the emblem in the middle, which stands for God is great, is the same. But what about this upper color? All of a sudden, green, which was the official flag color, is now blue. There could be very, very important implications in this. These colors do not have a strong basis in Islam. The colors, almost all the Arab countries have red and green and white, and some of them black. I don't think any of them have blue. Blue is a color that's more often reserved for the mosques, like the Great Blue Mosque in Istanbul. Some of you may have seen, probably a lot of you have. Blue is considered to be kind of a protectorate color. Now, why then does it appear that Iran may have a different color in its flag? Well, one reason, of course, is green was adopted by the opponents to Ahmadinejad. And in fact, in the demonstrations last week, during the 31st anniversary, anyone wearing green apparently was arrested or beaten or both. So it may be simply trying to distance himself from, I'll say, the green. Here that means something a little different. Or maybe there's something more fundamental going on. But I don't think this is by accident. And I think it's something that we ought to pay attention to. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times just a day or two ago about that, and some of you may have seen it. Okay, and we're about out of our time. In fact, we're probably over our time. So let me just say a little bit about Iran's nuclear program. Oh, first, terrorism. What drives terrorists? They're not new. They go back at least to the 1st century AD, with a Jewish group that was trying to get rid of the Romans, but instead the Romans were too powerful. They were the weaker group, so they then worked on the Jewish people who were collaborating with the Romans. Well, that's still the way terrorism works, isn't it? It's people who have a strong political or religious or primarily one of the other social agenda that aren't militarily strong enough to compete with whomever they don't like. So they go to this terrorism approach. Here are some of the types of terrorism that I know about. You may know about others. I don't want to spend a lot of time on any of these. They're in your sheet. But I do want to say something about nuclear, because this is an issue that's so important with Iran right now. And there are two kinds, you might say two kinds of nuclear. I won't say atomic because it's really not the atom that's involved, it's the nucleus of the atom that's involved. Two types of nuclear weapons. And of course there's the nuclear reactor, all of which is intertwined. Okay, here's where a little physics and chemistry comes in, and I'll make it easy. But I couldn't let this opportunity pass. The energy from uranium in what's called nuclear fission is about 30 million times more per pound, say, than a pound of TNT. 30 million times more. No wonder it's such a great potential for a disaster, for a bomb. But TNT is not all that great either. In fact, gasoline has 14 times more energy in it per pound than does TNT. And what do you suppose about chocolate chip cookies? 8 times more energy per pound than TNT. So if you want to blow something up, you just give a bunch of teenagers some chocolate chip cookies and a hammer. That'll take care of it, right? So why is TNT a good explosive? Because it releases its energy very, very quickly. Uranium releases its energy in about 1/1,000,000th of a second, TNT in milliseconds. Whereas chocolate chip cookies can take days. By the time I eat them, they get digested, the energy gets to the cell, I take a nap, and finally I get up and do something. But the point is then, there's a difference between how much energy is potentially stored in an atom, which is different than that which is stored in something like TNT or gasoline or chocolate chip cookies, because they are not, it's not the atom that's involved there, it's not the nucleus that's involved there, it's the bonding, the sharing, the stickiness between two atoms. So we have chemical energy on that hand and nuclear energy in the nucleus. Now, uranium is naturally occurring. You can go out in the mountains and find uranium. And you probably have, some of you may have radon in your basements. It probably comes from uranium that's down in the soil that's undergoing its fission and producing radon that comes up through your basement floor. Small amounts, we hope. This particular kind of uranium is called 235 because that's how much it weighs. It's nuclear mass, we would say. Is only about 0.7% of all the uranium you would dig up in the earth. Really small. Most of the rest of it is something a little bit heavier, 238 versus 235, 99 plus. This stuff over here, the heavy stuff, the abundant stuff, isn't any good for nuclear fission. So what you have to do is to try to get this number raised. If you want to use a nuclear reactor to make electricity, maybe 3.5%. If you want to make a nuclear weapon, you have to go from 0.7 to 85 or so percent. That's called enrichment. And you probably have heard about the centrifuges that Iran has, which is the common way to do these. Now, do you know how big a centrifuge is? Well, I would be a little bigger than one. Or maybe this size, maybe that high. But it takes thousands of them to do the concentration, the enrichment, because each step, you only go from the 235 and the 238, you're trying to separate them. And there isn't much difference in mass. And the centrifuge is spinning real fast, so the heavy stuff that you don't want gets thrown to the outside. The light stuff that you want stays in the center, and you pull it out. But each one of these steps only increases by about 1%. So it takes hundreds of steps. But you can do it in these rooms full of centrifuges. In this room, you could probably put, 200 or 300, maybe 500 centrifuges. The size of a gym, you could probably put 1,000, maybe more. So they're pretty easy to hide. So if you find that Iran is putting them in caves, which they claim to be, and you blow one up, but you don't know if you got them all or not, because it's not a great big, like a nuclear power plant that you can see from outer space. So in this process, then, you're trying to concentrate this radioactive stuff to a high enough level that either it can make heat to drive a turbine, to turn a generator to make electricity, or if you get it more concentrated and you slam it together, you reach what's called a critical mass and it explodes. So the trick for uranium bombs is to get the high quality uranium. And then smashing them together is not too hard. Plutonium is the opposite. Plutonium is hard to get together, but fairly easy to get. Then you can do what's called deblending. You may have heard that that Ahmadinejad at least once agreed, maybe more than once, that he would allow a certain percent of uranium from Iran go to France or Russia to be what's called deblended, unenriched. You mix the good stuff with other things so that it no longer is capable of being a nuclear bomb. And then there's something called dirty bombs. You know what those are? Those are also radioactive, but they're not nuclear bombs. They're not uranium bombs like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and so on. The dirty bomb is where you take some uranium or some radioactive material, you mix it with, or you put TNT around it, you blow it up, and you hope that the radioactivity will get scattered around and people will get sick. They're pretty limited in their capacity. There's a great fear of them because radioactivity sounds dangerous, which it is. Okay, I think that's the last one. Yep. Okay, thank you. I'll be glad to take some questions, and I'm sorry I ran over time.
As this is going to be broadcast, and Kent Thompson and his crew say that you can probably watch this 2 nights from now as they program it, I need to
turn it on.
There we go. It needs to warm up. Good. All right, thank you. Hello? Questions, and I'll hand the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you for coming again. We appreciate your time and your information. One of the points you raised early on was, did it really matter who had capability for nuclear weapons? You know, my short answer would be no, if the owners are not going to use them. Is Iran likely to use it if they get it?
Okay, that's a good question. How many think, yes, Iran would use them if they had a nuclear weapon? Whoa, there are not many. Are the rest of you no or undecided? How many no's? A lot of no's. I won't ask for undecideds. My personal opinion is that no, they would not. Now, Ahmadinejad is kind of a wild card, but he doesn't run the country. In the end, he doesn't run the country. It's run by who? Ayatollah Khomeini, right? So Ahmadinejad is a front guy. I don't believe Iran would use the nuclear weapon if they have it. I believe they hate Israel, and they want to see this as a balance of power against the Israelis and their nuclear weapons. But it's an opinion. No one knows the test. You know, Pakistan and India both have nuclear weapons. There's a lot of unhappiness between those two. So far, they haven't. But there's no guarantee.
Yeah.
Larry, what role do you think economic sanctions played after the first Gulf War in Saddam Hussein's decision to drop his weapons of mass destruction program?
Everybody heard the question, I guess. Anybody have an answer? I suppose Saddam Hussein was about as unpredictable as Ahmadinejad, but more evil. I don't think the economic sanctions, I think the people who are most affected by economic sanctions are not the ones that ought to be affected, the government and the military, because somehow, you know, Iraq has a lot of oil. Somehow they were able to get money into those sources. Saddam had how many palaces? I've forgotten. 9, was it? Something like that. So I'm sure it made a difference, Jim, but I don't think it was a huge difference.
Yeah.
Your third slide really kind of caught me by surprise. Talk about the gross domestic product.
Oh, yes, I
Each
forgot to
country-
say anything about that.
And I didn't realize that Saudi Arabia comes in quite a distant fourth to United Arab Emirates, Kuwait. Am I reading that correctly? That
Yeah, he's looking at that PowerPoint slide that shows the gross domestic product per capita. Per capita, and that's the key, because Saudi Arabia has 28 million people, Qatar has 1 million. And I didn't put that on, I meant to mention that here, but I couldn't get it on the slide, I already had too much. But the answer really is a lot of income and not many people. Thank you, good question, appreciate that clarification.
We've kind of agreed here that we don't think that they would use a nuclear bomb if they had it. But I've heard it said that Israel would never tolerate Iran having a nuclear bomb, and what would they do about it if they did get one?
Aha, now there's a real important question as well. Would Israel tolerate anybody else in the Gulf, really, either Arabic or Persian, having a nuclear weapon? I don't think they have much choice, to be truthful. I don't think they would attack Iran. I think they would be foolish if they did. Iran has a population that's 100 or more times larger than Israel. It would invoke the wrath of the entire Arab world and probably the whole world for the first user, once we did it, of nuclear weapons. I think they will do all they can to try to get the U.S. to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. I don't think the Israelis would strike Iran, but they might. I mean, it's not a given, that's for sure, and it's not very far from Israel over to Iran. I mean, we're talking less than 1,000 miles. The Israelis have the capability, they have the rockets to deliver it, and they have the weapons. Presumably, I mean, they, I think, still have only accidentally admitted it, but they do have. But I don't think they would. But it's purely opinion.
Okay. To pick at your statistics again, Iraq is not 10 to 15% Shiite, it's 55% Shiite. That is, you can't understand Iraq unless you keep that in mind. But my question...
Well, whatever's on the slide is what I got from the World Bank or
no.
UN.
Iraq is about 55% Shiite. Okay, to what extent is the United States a major source of instability in the Arabian Gulf?
I think we're a big source of instability. It goes back, the Iranians with Mossadegh. More recently, we're viewed as invaders. This is a very sore point with probably every country in the Gulf, maybe not so much with Qatar, maybe not so much with the United Arab Emirates, but certainly with the rest of them. Well, maybe not Bahrain either, but the rest of them. We're viewed as instability because we're where they think we shouldn't be, but yet they don't want the worst outcome from those countries to affect them. And one of the big questions in Iraq is, so we pull out of Iraq, making a lot of Arabs happy. Let's see, I'm supposed to stay over here, right? And let's say the worst case happened where Iraq would implode. Would that be contagious to other Gulf states? Well, so far all the terrorists and radicalism in Iraq doesn't seem to have spread in the Gulf. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it would just be Iraq that disintegrates into 2 or 3 parts. But part of our strategy is to try to keep it together as a whole. Well, that didn't work real well in the Balkans, and maybe it won't work in Iraq, and maybe whenever we finally leave, it won't stay together. But then the question is, would it spill out into the other Gulf countries? I would guess probably not, but again, there's no way of knowing for sure. It certainly could with the Kurds on the north. The Shias and Sunnis, who knows? What we do know is Saddam Hussein kept such a tight hand that I guess it wasn't unlike Tito in Yugoslavia. If you have a strong enough military presence and you're harsh enough,
you can make it look like things are getting along pretty well until the pressure's released. Sort of like putting your finger in a vise, you know it hurts, and then you take the vise off, well, it still hurts, but not as bad. Well, maybe that's the way it works.
Larry, let me ask you to test your hypothesis for a minute that, quote, in the Arab Gulf, they don't like us there. Several countries now have missiles that are provided by the United States with their apparent support. They're on their territory. We have bases. We have significant naval presence in the Arabian Gulf. And while there may not be a public acknowledgement of that, and it may be very much understated, it's difficult to believe that our presence there is not desired by any number of governments. Can you comment? You see them going. It's easy to say they don't like us. That's fine, and they don't. But we're on territory there. We're in the Straits of Hormuz. We're everywhere. To some extent, maybe as a proxy for the Western world. But talk about that a little bit. The unsaid part that lets us be there in the way we are.
Well, I don't know how much is unsaid and even unknown. But certainly we have a very high presence we have a high presence, but it isn't a visible presence. For example, in the UAE, this huge, well, not huge, but very large American air base out in the middle of the desert, you could spend a lot of time in the UAE and never know that there's an air base there. Unless you go to the officers club and all of a sudden you see all these young white guys with crew cuts, and you think, boy, those are funny looking Arabs. And they don't speak Arabic. And I suspect it's not so much in Qatar, because Qatar is such a small place that military presence, the times I've been there, is pretty obvious. But there's a strong feeling, I think, throughout the Gulf countries and in most of those ring countries around it, that because the United States has so much physical power, military power, and a lot of international political clout, that even behind the scenes they can make things happen that you might not really know about. And so I guess that would be kind of an unspoken, not highly visible, but yet highly influential in the way some of these countries work and how they relate to each other. I'm not sure if that's helped much, Dave, but yeah.
One last question here.
The last one. This is under the category of be careful what you wish for, and you touched on this. If we stop sending all those petrodollars to Saudi Arabia, I have a sense that all those dollars are keeping a lid on things in what would probably be an unstable country if it weren't for the social programs keeping all the dissident groups sort of quiet. So, if we stop sending petrodollars to Saudi Arabia, does that mean it destabilizes the country? And is there anything worse you can imagine?
Well, I suppose if no one sent petrodollars to Saudi Arabia, that would be a possibility. It's in the hypothetical in a way that we need oil. We get, 18% of our oil comes from the Arabian Gulf, and most of that's from Saudi Arabia, almost all of it. Would they miss our 18%? Sure. Would somebody else like China buy it? Probably, or India. So it might not make a lot of difference. But in the hypothetical that they lost the income, the revenue, then you're faced with a different situation. How long would the accrued money, which these countries have, I mean, it's billions of dollars. In Abu Dhabi, for example, the Abu Dhabi development company called Mubadala has something like 800 billion US dollars in reserve. 800 billion. As I read somewhere, the richest development country on the planet or on the universe. So for a while they could get by on that. But in Saudi Arabia, you see, is a lot different than it's really the most conservative of those 8 countries in terms of now that the Taliban is sort of out of government for a while, Saudi Arabia is clearly the most repressive of women of any of the Arab countries, for sure. Many of the people in Saudi Arabia have not shared in the wealth that some have. And that's true in a lot of countries, although in some of them there's quite a flow of revenue from the ruling family to people that aren't in the ruling family, but Saudi Arabia is not so much. Would it destabilize Saudi Arabia? Well, it's probably mixed. On the one hand, bin Laden would be happy if there was no Western influence in Saudi Arabia. Well, he says he'd be happy. Would he be? Who knows? If it caused him to back off a bit from putting pressure on the Saudi government, that probably would be good. Would the people want to go backwards and have less technology and less conveniences? I don't think so. So I think the oil revenue props up the government, the monarchy. It props up the standard of living enormously. And most people wouldn't willfully want to go back to a lower standard of living. And I can tell you in those Bedouin countries, it was pretty bad. When you get out in, say, in the empty quarter, that enormous desert space shared between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Yemen and a little bit with Oman, and you visit these camel farms, now these are not Emiratis, they're usually Yemenis, but that's basic living. I mean, down to really virtually nothing. So, do those Bedouin countries want to go back to that? I don't think so. Would it be destabilizing? I suppose it probably would. Would it threaten the royal family? Probably. Would they survive? I wouldn't be surprised.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. See you next Monday night when Dr. Jim Lindberg will be talking about U.S. and China. Thank you all for braving a very cold but not snowy night. See you next week.